The kettle shrieked inside the cramped trailer and Charles Hartman poured 2 mugs of tea, though only one would ever be touched. He set the untouched cup across from him, where Sarah's chair used to be, then stared at the steam twisting upward like all the plans that had slipped through his fingers. Outside, rain misted over Woodbury Meadows, turning the dirt lanes to pale clay. The trailer park looked smaller every dawn, but the bills on his table seemed to grow. Final notice read over the faded blue of an MIT diploma and a photograph of happier days. He zipped his worn jacket, grabbed a roll of wrenches, and headed down the row of dented homes to fix Mrs. Peterson's stalled pickup. The 75-year-old widow waited with worry etched deep into her cheeks until the replacement alternator clicked into place. When the engine roared back to life, she pressed a slice of peach cobbler and a crumpled 20 into his hand, calling him a godsend. Charles forced a smile, but when she disappeared inside, the weight of the day settled onto his spine. His phone buzzed. Amelia's message. The science fair registration fee was due tomorrow, $50. He was still 40 short. Back in the trailer, the second mug of tea was stone cold. He tucked Mrs. Peterson's 20 under Amelia's open notebook and told the silent walls they'd managed somehow. A knock sent the bills fluttering. Benjamin Lopez, big-hearted neighbor, whispered that the park's owner planned to evict anyone 6 weeks behind. Charles thanked him and shut the door gently, pride rattling around in the hollow left by fear. Late afternoon, he coaxed his coughing pickup down the county road toward a farm job that might keep eviction at bay. The check engine light glared, but he kept driving until a sleek black hybrid, outlandish against the cornfields, flashed its hazards. He almost kept going, had to, but the sight of a young woman stranded in the rain made him brake. Audrey Woodward's frustration gave way to hope when she saw the tools. Charles raised the hood and felt an old electricity spark in his chest. The prototype powertrain was an orchestra of parts he'd once dreamed of conducting. 30 silent. Minutes later, he rerouted wires, cooled a thermal choke point, and the car purred alive, smoother than showroom perfect. Audrey offered crisp bills. He waved them off. She handed him a business card instead, Woodward Technologies, and promised her mother would want to know his name. He tucked the card away like a hot coal and drove home, too late for the farm job, and no closer to the $50. Night settled over the trailer. Amelia, curly hair falling over circuit diagrams, spoke excitedly about a scholarship that could follow the state finals. Charles promised the fee was handled. After she slept, he unfolded the couch, stared at the ceiling, and wondered how long a man could live on promises. At dawn the next morning, rotor blades hammered the sky. A helicopter descended onto the muddy community field, blowing grit across lawns and waking every neighbor. Amelia burst outside in pajamas. Charles, half-dressed, met Pamela Woodward, silver-haired, steel-voiced, who stepped from the cabin as though helicopters were taxis. She'd read Audrey's report and wanted immediately to understand what kind of roadside mechanic could out-engineer her R&D division. Would he join her for breakfast? Amelia's hopeful eyes left him no room to decline. They lifted off, the park shrinking beneath them, trailers gleaming like puddles of tin. Charles stared down until the childhood swings looked like broken paperclips and, just for a heartbeat, felt the gravity of failure ease. The town diner smelled of scorched coffee and wet coats. Pamela spread a dossier across cheap formica, patent, filings bearing Charles's name, court transcripts of a lawsuit he'd lost when Sarah was dying, Davidson Automotive's subsequent innovation credits. She offered him the title of Director of Innovation, a salary that would fit no line in his current imagination, full health insurance, and a scholarship track for Amelia. He asked only that Amelia finish her semester before any move. Pamela agreed without hesitation, then gestured toward the window. The helicopter was still waiting because possibilities do not like to cool. They flew over forests and rivers to Brighton Heights, where Woodward Technologies towered in glass and fountain spray. Inside, magnetic rails held engine halves that whispered more than growled. Junior engineers eyed Charles's thrift store jeans, but their skepticism turned to awe when he traced a finger and named the flaws their models had missed. He felt himself come back to life cell by cell, until rage flared at a hanging banner that bragged about a thermal regulation patent acquired from Davidson. His patent. Pamela watched him notice, said nothing, but later handed him a pen. He signed, though his signature trembled, as Amelia clapped a hand over her mouth to muffle her joy. The helicopter returned them to Woodbury Meadows in golden evening light. Neighbors crowded the field. Mrs. Peterson crossed herself as the craft touched down. Pamela slipped into her SUV, leaving father and daughter to carry the news. Charles told the gathering they'd be moving after Amelia's finals. Warren Schmidt, the garage owner who once called him overqualified, couldn't decide whether to congratulate or apologize. Charles shook his hand anyway. That night, they packed in a daze. Amelia found an old photograph, Sarah cradling baby Amelia beside Charles in a bright laboratory. She said softly that her mother would be proud. Charles had no words, only tears that fell onto the picture frame like rain on glass. Neighbors hosted a farewell barbecue under sagging string lights. Benjamin grilled chicken, Mrs. Peterson brought cobbler, and even bully Jason Brooks muttered, "A clumsy good luck to Amelia." When the night ended, Benjamin pressed a folded bill into Charles's palm. "Just gas money," he said, and Charles did not refuse. 2 weeks later, they rolled out of Woodbury in a pickup hitched to a rental trailer. Amelia's garden bed lay empty, soil turned but unseeded. Tom Parker, the landlord, took the keys and wished them better fortunes than Woodbury could ever offer. Brighton Heights felt like a waking dream, a temporary apartment with windows taller than their trailer's length, an elevator that whispered, instead of clanked, lights that came on before you touched the switch. Charles brewed a single mug of tea, just one, and drank it as the city glittered below. Monday brought his first official day at Woodward, HR photos, security badge, company, laptop, and the hush of automatic doors that sealed behind him like the airlock of a spacecraft. In the innovation atrium, he greeted a half-dozen engineers, among them Dr. Elena Vasquez, whose skeptical eyes measured his every breath. Together, they reopened the prototype, and in hours the lab buzzed with fresh circuitry and surged hope. By mid-afternoon, they had a plausible fix for the thermal choke, and by evening, prototypes were already on the fabrication slate. Back at the apartment, Amelia babbled about laser cutters and fluid dynamics demos from her university orientation shuttle. She confessed nerves, but Charles told her that improvisation in a trailer lab would always outrank unlimited resources. She laughed, tension melting. The rest of the week blurred. Charles in 8-hour design sprints that became 14, Amelia building small miracles from scrap alloys. Friday, he finally glimpsed the sealed files Pamela had unlocked. Davidson's entire cache of acquired patents, every diagram he had once sketched under fluorescent night lab glare. Rage threatened to drown him, but curiosity swam harder. He spent the weekend cross-referencing old ideas with Woodward's ambitions, seeing how far his own stolen brilliance could still reach. On the Monday that began week 2, Robert Henderson, a silver-haired board member, arrived unannounced. He walked the lab with the air of a man smelling for overruns, but when Charles explained the low-cost workaround that saved both weight and money, Henderson's eyes lit in grudging respect. Afterward, Pamela slipped Charles a note. Henderson had resigned from Davidson's board a decade ago, disgusted by the same corporate theft that broke Charles's career. Allies sometimes come disguised. By Wednesday, Charles's team produced a test rig that exceeded efficiency targets by 15% and shaved $43 off projected unit cost. Henderson pushed for accelerated timelines and increased budgets. Pamela approved, her faith publicly vindicated, but triumph stirred old ghosts. Davidson Automotive's legal department sent a terse letter asserting prior art claims on one of Charles's new connector geometries, an attempt to intimidate. Pamela forwarded it to legal, then asked Charles whether he wanted to fight or redesign. The engineer who had once lost everything chose to fight, but smarter. He opened his personal archive and produced sketches predating Davidson's filings by 6 months, signed by lab witnesses, notarized by Sarah herself. Hands shook handing that proof over, but justice, once overdue, arrived overnight. Davidson withdrew. News of the skirmish reached the press, framing Charles as the comeback prodigy who had out-engineered both his past and the giants that wronged him. Reporters camped outside Woodward's gates. Amelia texted screenshots of articles to friends back in Woodbury, where his old neighbors read them over cracked phones. The same week, Amelia's alternative fuel prototype impressed professors so deeply that Brighton University invited her to present at an industry symposium. She spent nights in the apartment kitchen refining her model, soldering while Charles iterated engine designs at the living room table. They traded advice like colleagues occasionally laughing at how their world had tilted into something unrecognizable. For weeks after the Pulse 2 launch, the city treated Charles like a quietly minted legend. Handshakes in elevators, strangers nodding on the sidewalk, opinion pieces calling him Detroit's lost heir returned. Yet he never quite adjusted to the echo that trailed his name. At night, while Amelia bent over scholarship applications and solder fumes, he still half expected eviction notices to materialize on the stainless steel fridge. The echo deepened in late November, when Pamela knocked on his office door long after most lights in the building had gone dark. She carried no tablet, no contract, only a thin manila envelope and an expression edged with caution. She waited until the door clicked shut behind her. "I want you to read this before the board meeting tomorrow," she said, laying the envelope on his desk. The wood between them felt suddenly like ice. Inside sat a single photograph printed on matte paper. The prototype lab, empty, save for a figure crouched beside a dismantled Pulse 2 powertrain. The figure wore Charles's spare lab coat. The timestamp was from 2 nights ago, long after he'd gone home. He squinted, fighting the grain of the security camera. The posture was familiar. A shoulder dipped the way Amelia did when she concentrated. A chill curled up his back. Pamela slid a typed audit report after the photo. "Someone copied your new regulator design onto a portable drive. Security caught them leaving, but the drive is missing. The only anomaly is that badge number." She tapped a line of text. His badge number. The room pulsed. Impossible. He hadn't been in the lab that night. He'd been helping Amelia rehearse for her interview with the European Youth Engineering panel. Pamela's voice softened, as if she had rehearsed gentleness all afternoon. "I know you didn't take it, but not everyone on the board is inclined to believe the story ends there. Henderson is furious. Legal is bracing for lawsuits. Davidson could use this to paint your earlier vindication as a publicity stunt." A long, uneven breath left Charles's lungs. "So they think I stole my own design?" "Some of them do." She rested her hands on the desk, wedding ring finger bare, as always, and fixed him with a steadiness that once comforted, now felt like appraisal. "We need to find the real thief fast before tomorrow's vote on the expansion budget. If the board doubts your integrity, they'll gut R&D and fold the Pulse program into a safer division. Years of work, hundreds of jobs, gone." She paused. "And Henderson's support can't protect you if the evidence stays this thin." The old dread, courtrooms, subpoenas, Sarah's IV drip ticking beside him, rose like bile. He forced it down. "Show me every keycard swipe after hours this week." His voice scraped gravel. "And play back all corridor cams around 11 p.m. Tuesday." They worked until sunrise. Security footage revealed a tall figure in a hooded raincoat, tailing a cleaning crew. The coat's shoulders were wrong for Amelia, but the movement felt disturbingly familiar. Precise, economical, a trained engineer avoiding wasted motion. The badge they used did belong to him, but his own badge still lay warm in his pocket, meaning someone had cloned it. At 6:14 a.m., Pamela flicked off the monitor and rubbed her temples. "This is deliberate corporate espionage." Charles's thoughts shot to the one person who would relish watching Woodward implode while framing him: Edward Davidson. But Davidson had retired after the public apology. Unless retirement was a smokescreen. He checked his watch, realized Amelia would be waking soon. Her panel interview started at 10, He pictured her sitting across from Nobel-level scientists while headlines called her father a fraud. His fist tightened. "Give me 3 hours," he said. "I can prove where I was Tuesday night." He sped home, retrieved the apartment building, security logs from the concierge, and returned with stamped entries showing him inside at the exact theft window. Alibi secured, yet the question of who cloned his badge remained. Henderson convened an emergency board meeting at noon. The long, oak table bristled with silver laptops and wary expressions. Henderson motioned for silence and turned to Charles. "Your clearance status is under review," he said, voice grudgingly even. "But Ms. Woodward insists you address us." Charles stood, acknowledging 40 eyes that could decide to exile him again. He began with the apartment logs, produced screenshots from Amelia's rehearsal video call, time-stamped within the theft window, and ended by projecting side-by-side footage of the real thief. "Different gait, different height, roughly 6'2", he pointed out. "Also note the limp in his right leg." Dr. Vasquez at the far end whispered to her neighbor. Charles caught the whisper. "Gardner." Anthony Gardner, a senior, thermal engineer laid off by Davidson last year, walked with a limp from a skiing accident. He'd joined Woodward only 3 months earlier. Pamela keyed a command. HR pulled Gardner's badge profile. 6'2". Right leg injury history. Henderson exhaled, part relief, part rage. "Find him." Security swept the campus. Gardner's desk was empty, computer wiped, locker cleared, but an entry gate camera revealed him departing the underground garage. At 6 a.m., 2 hours before Pamela and Charles uncovered the footage. His destination, the regional airport. While federal investigators were summoned, Pamela reconvened the board. She reminded them the expansion vote was scheduled for that afternoon. A gray-haired director raised a hand. "Why should we greenlight billions when our IP just walked out the door?" Charles stepped forward before Pamela could answer. "Because if we retreat now, Davidson wins. They don't need the stolen drive, the leak alone will scare investors. But if we stay the course, launch on schedule, and open source the critical regulator spec under a defensive patent license, we remove Davidson's leverage. We become the standard instead of the target." The room rustled, board members trading glances between audacity and admiration. Henderson's thin smile returned. "Votes in 2 hours, he announced. "I suggest we study Mr. Hartman's proposal quickly." Pamela caught Charles's sleeve as the others filed out. "Open sourcing? Are you sure?" He remembered. Warren Schmidt's skepticism, Mrs. Peterson's cobbler, Benjamin's backyard barbecue, every kindness given without contract. "We built these engines to solve problems," he said, "not to hoard trophies." By late afternoon, Gardner was detained at O'Hare with the drive taped beneath a false insole. Destination Geneva, Davidson's new R&D satellite. News broke within minutes. Woodward's crisis flipped into a public relations triumph of swift justice. Henderson released a statement hailing Charles's vigilance and ethics. The board voted 12-1 to expand funding and, by Henderson's motion, appointed Charles to an executive committee overseeing company-wide innovation integrity. That night, back in the apartment, Amelia returned from her interview glowing like sunrise. "They invited me to Berlin this summer," she squealed, dumping papers across the sofa. "Full airfare. They called my design elegantly disruptive. What happened to you today?" She was already scrolling her phone for celebratory pizza when headlines flashed. Woodward foils theft, credits engineer turned hero. Charles eased onto the couch, exhaustion folding him. "Long day," he said. He considered telling her everything, espionage, the vote, the residual tremor in his hands, then decided she deserved one more hour of unalloyed joy. "They liked my presentation too." Amelia leaned her head on his shoulder, scrolling flight details. The kettle whistled. Charles stood to pour just one mug, then filled a second and placed it finally across from him at the table, steam rising to meet the empty chair as though Sarah had never missed a dawn. Outside, winter pinned glittering frost to the balcony, rails but inside. Father and daughter spoke of Berlin summers, open patents and engines that ran cooler than fear. The city lights trembled below, not with dread this time, but with the hum of machines designed by hands free of doubt and hearts no longer in exile. The success of the public test sent shockwaves through both the automotive press and the investor circuit. Overnight, orders for the Pulse 2 doubled, pushed along by live-stream replays of Charles's transparent fix and by tech blog headlines, referring to him, half in awe, half in meme, as the open-source mechanic who outran sabotage in real time. Woodward's share price climbed on a 5-day tear. Davidson's slipped just as quickly, its board forced into emergency sessions while analysts wondered aloud whether the century-old firm had finally been out-engineered for good. 3 mornings after the demonstration, a courier delivered a thick envelope to Pamela's office. Davidson petitioned a federal court for an emergency injunction, accusing Woodward of unlawfully disclosing trade secrets derived from still contested intellectual property. The petition leaned on Gardner's download, twisted timelines, and a claim that Charles's open-source release had exposed proprietary algorithms first developed under Davidson leadership. Henderson read the filing in silence, then tossed it across the conference table with a sound like a gauntlet hitting marble. Charles felt the old dread grip his chest, but he'd learned a new reflex. Instead of retreating, he began gathering proof. Within hours, he and the legal team assembled Gardner's arrest record, Zurich server logs, timestamps showing code injection after the open-source release, and, gem of gems, Sarah's notarized sketches dated months before Davidson's earliest patent claim. Amelia found a digital photo of those sketches on her childhood tablet and emailed it while walking between chemistry and calculus, marveling via text that her mother was still protecting them all these years later. Pre-hearing negotiations unfolded in a paneled room that smelled of old varnish and older grudges. Edward Davidson himself arrived, thinner than press photos, cane tapping a nervous rhythm. Rinn, identified now as Lawrence Rinn, director of strategic outreach, hovered. At his side, right leg still stiff. Davidson's lawyers argued trade secret theft. Woodward's team countered with timestamps and the Zurich connection, ending with Charles's calm presentation of Sarah's notarized sketches. When Pamela slid the certified copy across the table, Davidson's face drained of color. The lawyers conferred in a clumsy huddle. The cane stilled. Davidson asked for a recess. 10 minutes later, he returned alone, minus entourage, eyes rimmed in exhaustion. He spoke directly to Charles, voice low enough that even Pamela had to lean in to hear. "I built a company by pushing boundaries," he said, words catching. "But somewhere along the line, I started pushing people past theirs. You lost everything, once because I was too busy winning." There was no apology in the formal sense, just the brittle honesty of someone conceding a game that had gone on too long. He withdrew the petition before it ever reached the judge, handed Pamela a short letter of intent to sell Davidson's remaining hybrid engine patents to Woodward, and left the room leaning more on the cane than before. Henderson exhaled a slow breath that seemed to empty the years from his shoulders. "Well," he said, half to Charles, half to the wood-paneled walls, "that chapter's over." Yet the day held one more note. While lawyers drafted closing documents, Amelia's phone call broke through Charles's meeting. She spoke so quickly he barely caught the words. Her Berlin prototype had been shortlisted for the United Nations Youth Climate Grand Prize, and MIT's admissions office wanted a video interview, tonight, if possible, for early acceptance into the mechanical engineering program. She apologized for the short notice. Charles laughed at the symmetry of opportunities always arriving in pairs. In a rush of evening logistics, Pamela cleared an unused media studio on the innovation floor. Amelia set up her small model under studio lamps, while a Woodward videographer tweaked sound levels, and Charles waited outside pacing stripes into the carpet. He caught murmurs from behind the door, Amelia describing low-resource filtration cartridges, referencing spreadsheets of rural fuel data, pausing only once to breathe before explaining how inspiration can sprout in a trailer park if someone supplies enough patience and a crescent wrench. When the interview ended, she stepped into the hallway and collapsed into his arms, laughing until tears soaked both their sleeves. They didn't wait for official word. They celebrated anyway with vending machine hot chocolate in styrofoam cups, toasting Sarah, open source code, and the improbable safety of second chances. An email pinged just after midnight. The subject line read, "MIT Hacker Community welcomes Amelia Hartman." She screamed, then clapped both hands over her mouth, embarrassed by how perfectly the sound echoed down the empty corridor. Charles didn't mind the echo. He thought it sounded like history clearing its throat before telling a better story. Summer edged into a bright July, and every calendar square filled with arrows and red circles. One arrow pointed east to Geneva, where the United Nations hosted its Youth Climate Assembly. Another back to Michigan for the first large-scale Pulse 2 customer rollout. A third down to Woodbury Meadows, circled twice in blue, the day Charles had promised to return. Geneva's Palais des Nations smelled of polished marble and lilac hedges. Delegates in muted suits drifted through, echoing corridors while on the grand stage, young innovators rehearsed final lines. Amelia adjusted the lapel mic over her thrift store blazer. She had refused offers of something more formal, claiming comfort trumped couture, and rolled her prototype cart beneath a bank of lights that made the recycled cooking oil shimmer gold. Charles watched from a balcony, heart pounding with a mixture of pride and fear that felt like freefall. When Amelia stepped into the spotlight, she opening with a story the delegates couldn't have expected. A trailer park battered by winter winds, a father who brewed 2 cups of tea for 1 empty seat, a garden coaxed from reclaimed tomato seeds and stubborn hope. She spoke of small engines that asked for little and gave back freedom, of communities where electricity flickered but ingenuity never did. The room stilled into the kind of silence that vibrates. At the demonstration's end, a panel of ambassadors questioned her, some gently, some with razor precision. Amelia met each challenge head-on: chemical breakdown of frying oil residues, cost projection per cartridge, distribution via micro-grants to roadside vendors. She finished to applause that began like rain on a roof, soft, scattered, then swelled into a storm. By dusk, the email arrived. Youth Climate Grand Prize, awarded to Ms. Amelia Hartman. Charles and Amelia stood on the shores of Lake Geneva under a sky of slow-moving copper clouds, their reflections tremoring on the water. She pressed the glass trophy into his hands, saying it weighed less than she'd expected. He answered that it felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. They flew home through skeins of orange thunderclouds. In Detroit, a production manager met them at the gate, breathless with news. The first 5,000 Pulse 2 units had rolled off assembly, and the regulator's open-source lineage was stamped onto each owner's certificate. An idea Henderson insisted on to teach the market, where integrity starts. Photos of customers taking silent delivery filled Charles's phone feed. Each smiling driver looked like a tiny spyglass into an alternate future. 2 days later, Charles and Amelia packed the pickup, kept for sentiment, and drove the old highway back to Woodbury. Summer heat shimmered off the asphalt. Roadside Queen Anne's lace whirled white at passing mirror speed. They reached the trailer park just past noon. Roofs looked more rusted than Charles remembered, and the gravel lanes thinner, but the air still smelled faintly of cut grass mixed with motor oil. Benjamin Lopez sat on a porch with a toddler balanced on his knee, rocked up in surprise when the Hartmans pulled in. Mrs. Peterson shuffled over with a cane, new since spring, and scolded Charles for taking so long to visit. Warren Schmidt, riding a boom of Pulse 2 maintenance requests, swung by in a rebranded van just to say he'd reserved Charles the first production slot of the next model if he ever wanted it. They gathered in the weedy common lot where a year earlier, a helicopter's downdraft had set debris dancing. Now, a wooden sign rose from fresh posts. Woodbury Maker Shed Tools, 3D printers and evening classes, funded by the Hartman Family Innovation Grant. Inside, the open double doors sat lathes, soldering stations, bins of sensors, and 2 rebuilt laptops. Charles had arranged the purchase quietly, funneling bonus money through a local nonprofit. He watched Benjamin's astonishment widen to wonder as the neighbors drifted in, touching machines like artifacts from a distant age. Amelia demonstrated a 3D printer by fabricating a small replacement part for Mrs. Peterson's walker hinge. 30 minutes print time, priceless applause. When twilight bled copper over the park, they rolled out a portable screen. Charles, connected a laptop and hit play. The livestream recording of Amelia's UN speech flickered to life, white text subtitles so Mrs. Peterson wouldn't miss a word. The neighbors, people who had once slipped envelopes of casseroles and crumpled bills under Charles's door, watched until the applause in the video met applause in the lot and became the same thunder. Most families drifted home, but Charles stayed under the fairy light strands Benjamin had strung between old telephone poles. Crickets sang in weedy borders. He walked to his former trailer. A new tenant lived there, wind chimes tinkling. He placed a small metal plaque on the front step, engraved with a quote Sarah used to repeat when nights felt longest. Even an engine at idle is poised to move. Then he stepped back and let the memory settle in its rightful place. Not a weight, but a marker. On the drive out of Woodbury Meadows, Amelia leaned her head against the window. "Do you think it's weird?" she asked softly. "Putting shiny machines in a place where roofs still leak?" He thought of peach cobbler payments, of a kettle shrieking into empty air. "Leaks are easier to fix when you have tools," he answered. "And hope turns out to be the strongest adhesive I know." The road unwound toward Brighton Heights. Ahead lay dorm room move-in lists, committees drafting global fuel standards that referenced her cartridge design, late-night code pushes. On Charles's next project, an adaptive micro-hybrid for cargo drones made from pulse architecture but cheap enough for disaster zones. Each task felt enormous, yet none felt heavy. They reached the city at midnight, towers reflecting moonlight like calm water. In the apartment, Charles brewed 2 mugs of tea, a habit both unbroken and finally complete. They clinked cups in the quiet kitchen. Amelia set hers down, reached into her backpack and drew out one last envelope, edges creased from the journey. "I found this in Mom's recipe box with the notarized sketches," she said. The flap bore Sarah's looping handwriting. "Open when the engine starts running again." Charles unfolded the single sheet. Sarah had written it after the settlement, on a night he'd stayed late fighting lawyers. She told her future self, told him that brilliance doesn't vanish. It lies dormant until courage wakes it. She asked him, when the time came, to build something for others, not for vengeance. And she ended with a line that steadied his hands, even as they trembled. "Promise me you'll remember that the real patent is not the design, but the love that powers its maker." He looked at Amelia, whose eyes shone with the same fierce clarity Sarah once carried. Beyond the windows, the city stirred under a pulse of quiet engines, some running on code born in a trailer park, some on recycled cooking oil, all on stories that refused to surrender. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. Tomorrow would bring flight itineraries to Cambridge, test rigs for drone hybrids, grant paperwork for the maker shed. Tonight, father and daughter drank their tea while dawn edged up behind the skyline, light expanding in silent waves like a regulator easing power from battery to engine, seamless, purposeful, and finally gloriously free. A full year passed and the rhythm of their new lives settled into something both ordinary and quietly epic. Charles rose each morning before sunrise, brewed 2 mugs of tea, one for himself, the second out of habit, then rode the elevator, down from the apartment to Woodward's Skunk Works Annex, a former textile mill now packed with humming prototypes of small cargo aircraft. The adaptive micro-hybrid engine he'd imagined on the late drive from Woodbury had grown from mock-ups to flight-worthy units, each one tuned to sip fuel the way a sparrow sips water. Engineers nicknamed the program Project Sparrow, and by August they had a half-dozen test drones lifting medical supplies over Michigan farmland. Amelia, meanwhile, traded dorm cafeterias for late nights in MIT's Edgerton Center. She co-authored a paper on decentralized biofuel collection using waste streams from campus dining halls, then reworked the paper into a proof-of-concept system small enough to fit in shipping containers. On weekends, she FaceTimed Charles, the screen filled with solder fumes and whiteboard equations while she asked for quick sanity checks that usually ended with both of them laughing at how quickly their roles of mentor and colleague blended. But life kept a knack for circling back. One October afternoon, as leaves burned gold along the Charles River, Amelia called with a tremor in her voice that Charles hadn't heard since Woodbury days. A hurricane had ravaged part of the Gulf Coast, displacing thousands and severing Ground transport. FEMA and NGOs were scrambling for ways to ferry medical kits across flooded back roads. Amelia's biofuel cartridge, cheap and modular, suddenly looked ideal. But they needed airlift platforms that could launch from makeshift clearings, land on patchy asphalt, and burn whatever fuel aid workers could scavenge from restaurant fryers. Charles didn't sleep that night. By dawn, he had rerouted Project Sparrow's test fleet. By noon, 3 drones were dismantled, loaded onto a military cargo plane alongside pallets of Amelia's cartridges, and flown south under a cooperative waiver secured by Pamela's government affairs team with breathtaking speed. In the hurricane's wake, makeshift cook oil depots sprang up in school parking lots where volunteers filtered grease through coffee filters and stuffed it into Amelia's pint-sized tanks. Sparrow drones landed on tennis courts, delivered vials of insulin, lifted out blood samples and returned for more. Rotor blades beating stories into the humid air. Stories of a trailer park mechanic and his daughter, whose open designs could outrun disaster. News crews filmed the landings. A BBC anchor concluded a live segment with the line, "Some engines run on biofuel, others run on hope." Charles watched the footage from a temporary command trailer, headset askew, eyes red not from exhaustion, but from the quiet knowledge that Sarah's letter had foretold this precise moment. Weeks later, the maker shed in Woodbury hosted an overflow crowd. Kids printed replacement prop rotor sleeves for Sparrow 4, watching live streams where their parts were installed in the field hours later. Mrs. Peterson, leaning on her new Walker hinge, joked that she'd lived long enough to see Cobbler. Power TM, save the world one pie at a time. At year's end, Amelia flew home for winter break. She and Charles drove to Woodbury in a snow flurry, Rust Belt December wind whistling through old truck seals. They stopped beside the maker shed, now trimmed with holiday lights. Inside, a dozen neighbors crowded around a display showing Sparrow, flight telemetry from the Gulf, altitude, battery charge, gallons of cooking oil converted. Each line of data felt like a heartbeat. Benjamin, holding his toddler, now a sturdy boy who loved to press the 3D printer's start button, asked Amelia if she still thought it was weird placing shiny machines in leaky roof neighborhoods. "Not weird," she answered, ruffling the boy's hair. "Just fair." They stood in a circle of heating lamps and tool chatter while snow dusted the threshold. Outside, dusk gathered the pale edges of town and drew them inward like closing hands, but inside, light spilled into every upturned face. Charles caught Amelia's eye over the glow of printer LEDs. She tapped her watch. Tea time. Unspoken. They said their goodbyes and stepped back into snow that seemed to hush the rest of the world. Back in the apartment, Charles brewed 2 mugs. He set one. Across from him, then paused, reached into the cupboard and pulled down a third. When Amelia came to the table, she laughed softly at the sight. "For Mom," she whispered. "For Mom," he agreed. They drank, steam curling upward, meeting the shadow of a woman no longer absent but softly folded into every engine, every drone, every open blueprint shared into the world. And as winter pressed its cold palms against the window, the apartment stayed bright, warmed by a promise neither of them would ever need to open alone again.